right. Before we get started with this event, I wanted to let you know, first of all, that this is being recorded and that also as an attendee, you'll be able to listen to what's going on, but you won't be able to talk. You'll be able to see speakers at times, but you will not be seen. Your video won't be playing. Nobody will be able to see what you're doing. The slides will be shared at times like now, and you'll be able to see those. And during the event, you'll be able to enter questions, share questions to the speakers, to the panelists. And we'll pick those up during the Q&A session as best we can, and given the time that we have. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to the Gold Coast Neighbors Association presentation of Chicago's Gold Coast, the folks, the facades, and the fables. We're delighted that you could be here with us tonight. Gold Coast Neighbors Association regards as part of its mission to encourage an understanding of the history of the Gold Coast and all of the wonderful things about our neighborhood that go back well over 100 years. I'm really looking forward to tonight's presentation. And to introduce our speaker, I'm going to introduce our History and Education Committee Chair, Amy Lamar. Amy, take it away.
Sorry. Our guide for this evening is Scottie Perry, a longtime Gold Coast resident. Having lived around the world, she developed a true passion for the history of her surroundings and shared her knowledge as a guide and docent in many of the places she has lived. Settled back in the Gold Coast, she is a volunteer docent at the Chicago History Museum, a volunteer of the Pritzker Military Museum and Library, and additionally provides walking tours of the Gold Coast and both Graceland and Rosehill cemeteries. Please give a warm welcome to my history geek dear friend, Scottie Perry.
Thanks, Ames. I am a history geek for sure. Let's see if I can. Good evening. As everyone's welcoming you here, I will do the same thing. I'm going to give you the Gold Coast tour. My name is Scottie, and I will be your guide. Although most of us live here and are familiar with the neighborhood, I think we often wonder, what's the story behind all this? How did it happen? And sometimes even when we look at the houses, we go, what's the deal with that house? So let's view the familiar neighborhood through the eyes of history and by telling the stories. The tour will take about 40 minutes, and it will be mostly a slide presentation with me giving background information, and will include primarily homes on Astor Street. At the conclusion, there will be a Q&A session, and be sure to let us know what you think as we go along and if you have questions. First of all, some background and history about the neighborhood. Basically, our neighborhood exists today, the Gold Coast, as a result of a convergence of three different factors. First of all, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Secondarily, the Catholic Church and the Catholic Cemetery. And thirdly, Potter Palmer. The fire of 1871 is self-explanatory. Suddenly, there's all this vacant land. Then the Catholic Church was granted its first diocese in Chicago in 1880. So there was a need for a stately place to house the archdiocese. And the large Catholic church located south of Lincoln Park was being relocated. More vacant land. And finally, once again, Potter Palmer. He was a visionary and he was driven. He had successfully developed an empire downtown in the Loop, and indeed was in the process of rebuilding this empire after the fire. But this opportunity was just too big for him to pass up. So his vision fundamentally was to establish a new wealthy conclave to replace the South Prairie Avenue of wealth on the south side of the city. So now we're going to go to some slides to help tell the story. So let's start with the Cardinals Mansion at the top, right south of Lincoln Park. This mansion was built in 1880, and it was the first major structure built here after the fire. As I said, until 1880, there was no archdiocese in Chicago, but primarily because of the growth of the German Catholic population, much of it in Old Town here in Chicago, that made it possible for an archdiocese to be established in 1880. And concurrently, the Catholic cemetery was being relocated. This large cemetery was about 4 blocks square. And we think the boundaries were basically Schiller to the south, Dearborn to the west, North Avenue, and the lake. We really have little detail of this of records because so much was destroyed at the time, and much of the rest of records of the Catholic Church were destroyed. So we know that the relocation was happening at the same time that the city cemetery, which is now Lincoln Park, was also being moved. By the way, for those of us who live in the neighborhood, that's why Astor Street takes a bit of a dog leg, if you will, at the corner of Astor and Schiller, because that was the cemetery boundary that they left the same. So as a result of these things, the Cardinals Mansion was constructed, and Potter Palmer bought the land that was the Catholic cemetery. So when we get to look at these, hold on one second, let me get it. Okay, so what you're looking at now is the Cardinals Mansion, is the side entrance to the mansion. It's actually, many of us think it's the front because it's very grand and it has a balcony on the top. But that's not the case. Actually, it was just a loop for carriage arrivals under a porte-cochere. The formal entrance, what you're looking at now, was actually on State Street. Few people have actually been inside in the recent past, as the Cardinal no longer lives here or holds functions here, not many. But records show a magnificent interior, a beautiful chapel, and stately gas lanterns surrounding the home. If you'll note, this building has 19 chimneys. This is an amazing picture. And it's often mentioned when you read things about the Cardinals Mansion, they will talk about these 19 chimneys, but it's a way to reinforce the size of this mansion and how difficult it was to heat in 1880. In the next shot, you will see, you get a feeling at least for how large this property is. In an area that's very condensed, this property is a full city block. And what you're looking at now is the carriage house in the back portion of the property. It originally was housing for the nuns. There was also a space, as you can see to the right, for carriages and later automobiles. It's now little used, but the nuns continue to plant a small fenced garden in the backyard every summer. Looking at the mansion today, little has changed since 1880. On and off, there are conversations regarding the sale of the property by the church, but it's landmarked and it can't be destroyed. So selling it is a difficult and complicated process. It is said, when I was doing some of this reading, it consistently talked about the constructing this. And they kept mentioning that it cost $15,000 to, quote, fill in the swamp before they could build anything. Reminding us once again that this whole land that we're talking about, where the Gold Coast is, was nothing but a swamp. So next we'll talk about the Patterson-McCormick Mansion. This was built in 1893. The architect was McKim, Mead, and White. Isn't that magnificent? It's really one of the most magnificent houses on the street. It was built by Joseph Medill, who was the owner and editor of the Chicago Tribune. And he built it for his daughter, Nellie, who was married to Robert Patterson. He was also later owner and editor of the Chicago Tribune. The house was later sold to Cyrus McCormick Jr. in 1928. And he expanded the mansion You can see the expansion in the back of this photograph. He added a wing that was designed by David Adler to house his antique car collection and established that garden in the back of the house. The property is landmarked, and like the Cardinal's mansion, it looks very much like it did after Cyrus incorporated the side wing. Actually, it became the Bateman School, owned and managed by the two elderly Bateman sisters who were characters. And that occupied the building from 1950 until the early 70s. It was a school for kids who were interested in a curriculum for the arts. I actually was a substitute teacher there before it closed. And much to my surprise, the kids loved to use the bathroom. They were huge rooms with marble floors, magnificent gilt mirrors, pedestal sinks, footed bathtubs, and gorgeous hardware. It was a great place for them to hang out and have a small party. Originally, the mansion was, we think, 80 rooms. However, this was actually difficult to discern sometimes because when you looked at the plans, sometimes a closet was equally opulent and large as much as a normal bedroom. So they think that some of those were actually just closets, but actually technically it was 80 rooms. There are now 6 condos in the major facility, and there are 3 condos back on the side that David Adler built. So next we're going to talk about the Garfield King house. This is directly across the street from the McCormick Mansion. And right now it's unfortunately a 1960s high rise. So let's look instead at what stood here before. All right, this is the grand mansion of Garfield King, designed by Dangler and Adler in 1913. King was the owner of a very successful brokerage firm, and like so many people who lived in the Gold Coast at that time, he also had an estate in Lake Forest where they could summer, if you will. But the real story here is about his daughter, whose name was Ginevra King. She was a society queen who was well known for her beauty and social status, which this was not lost on the young men in her circle. And one of those men was F. Scott Fitzgerald, who fell for her. Now, unfortunately for him, ultimately, this was not reciprocated. But lucky for us, many of his female characters were said to be based on her. For example, Daisy Buchanan in The Great Gatsby. She was lovely and charming, an heiress, but she was totally devoid of depth or conscience. Ginevra married twice, lastly to John Perry of Carson, Perry and Scott. And F. Scott, as we know, married socialite Zelda, and they both died tragically in their early 40s. This is one of my favorites. You'll see why. This is the Edward P. Russell House at 1440 North Astor. It's a Holabird and Root house. It was built in 1929, and from what I can tell, it was the last private residence to be built in these blocks that we're talking about today. It's noted as one of the most significant Art Deco homes in all of Chicago. There are quite a few Art Deco buildings, but not many homes. The limestone is from Las France. The beautiful ironwork, which was meticulously done, came from downstate Illinois. Mr. Russell was a prominent banker. He designed the property to accommodate homes for both of his daughters. So floor 2 and 3 were homes for his 2 daughters. Unfortunately and sadly, with the onset of the Depression, his wife's death, his business issues, he sold the house at a pretty substantial loss and later committed suicide. The current owners, bless their hearts, and this is wonderful, have done a wonderful job, gone to great lengths to take the residence back to its original glory. Here's one of the shots of the entryway. It's truly beautiful. In the 1960s and 70s, as was true of many, many of the houses on Astor Street, they were chopped up into apartments. And this building was chopped up to 10 apartments, and I actually lived in one of them. My entire apartment was about the size of a large refrigerator. And for those of you who are old-time movie buffs, Art LaFleur lived in the building as well. Before his relocation to Hollywood to become an actor, he appeared in The Field of Dreams, became Babe Ruth in Sandlot, a man in Man of the House, and many more character roles. The next house is the Louise de Koven Bowen House. It was at 1430 North Astor, and once again, I'm sad to say, it's now a high-rise. Before it was a high-rise, this wonderful house was built in 1891 by Burling and Whitehouse. The house, interestingly enough, did not front on Astor Street. It instead faced a large side lot that served as a front yard. And eventually, in 1916, her daughter married William Blair. Yep, that William Blair. And she built a house for them on the lot that faced her house. So they had a common yard, and neither house fronted on Astor Street. They were well known for doing things for the youth of the era of the neighborhood, and every winter they would flood the yard, and the neighborhood kids will come to skate. Louise was a champion of social reform. Louise de Koven Bowen was just amazing. She was an activist for the rights of children and minorities. She was a suffragette for women's rights, a founder of the juvenile court here in Chicago. She was active in Hull House and took care of Jane Addams when her health was declining. Later, she moved into Hull House herself. She lived to be 94 years of age. And check out this picture. No wonder she was so successful. Could you possibly say no to that woman? She made a lot of things happen. Her family, interesting enough, and for those of you who are familiar with the neighborhood, her family was a pioneer of early Chicago. And as you might remember, the Chicago fire started on de Koven Street, which was named after her father, John de Koven. This mansion that today stands at the corner of Dearborn and Elm, was once the famous Biggs restaurant, was built by her father, John de Koven, in 1874. He died in this house in 1898. It's now a smoking lounge. Okay, so we go to the famous castle. This is the Palmer Castle. The address for this was 100 Lakeshore Drive, which is interesting because it's not the real address, but they like the number, so they are the Palmers, and so that's what it's named. The architect was Henry Ives Cobb, and it was built in 1885. This is the second property that was built after the Cardinal's Mansion, and these dates give us some insight into what Potter Palmer's plan was. This house was completed in 1885, but the project began in 1882. So this building, this grand castle, was a great draw to solidify Potter's goal of encouraging others to come to his neighborhood. So look where I live and look where you can live. Sadly, this was demolished in 1850. We Chicago folks talk a lot about the Palmers. We know much about the Palmers because they're legends and their name pops up all the time in history, i.e. the Palmer House downtown in Chicago that was a wedding gift for his wife. And it was 6 weeks old when the fire occurred and it burned to the ground. So he rebuilt it. And I don't know about you ladies, but I did not get a hotel when I was married, but Bertha did. So he began rebuilding it. But I discovered two quotes about the Palmers that I thought really reflected for us what they were like. The first is from Bertha, and here she is. She read a speech at the opening of the Women's Building at the White City Fair in 1893. And what she said in this speech was, this is the Women's Building at the fair. Look how grand it is. She said, even more important than the discovery of Columbus is the fact that the general government has now discovered women. Good for her. Bertha was not known for being frugal. If you take a look at this, this is how she decorated the entry hall to the Palmer Castle. So she was quite a lavish spender. And it's said that while Potter Palmer's attorneys were drafting his will, they cautioned him, don't leave all your money to her. You know, you shouldn't do that. She's younger, she will likely remarry, and he'll get all the money. Potter responded, well, that's okay. He's gonna need it. Had a great sense of humor, didn't he? The next house is also near and dear to my heart. It's the William Kerfoot House at 1425 North Astor. This was built in 1895. William Kerfoot really embodies the spirit of Chicago and the determination that we as a city had in order to rebuild our world after that horrendous fire. This picture is what this home looked like in 1895 when it was brand new. However, 24 years earlier, on October 8th, 1871, Kerfoot lost everything: his home, his possessions, and his real estate business. And by the way, 100,000 other citizens of Chicago were in the same boat. He actually had a carriage of some of his possessions, and it was stolen. So he truly had absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and his family. However, within 1 week of the fire stopping, he had rebuilt his business near the spot where his office had been. Except he didn't build it on his property because his land was still simply too hot to build on. And to announce his new business, you can see this a little bit in there, but he hung this sign up on his shack. And as you can see, William D. Kerfoot is at 59 Union Park, all gone, but wife, children, and energy. Smart guy. He listed his wife first. Well done, William Kerfoot. And from there, in 20 some odd years later, he lived in that house on Astor Street. So there were fortunes to be made. This is the Farnsworth House at 1421 North Astor. It was built in 1889. Now, y'all who are architecture buffs are thinking, that's not the Farnsworth House. And so we'll get to that in a minute. Let's call this the Farnsworth home, okay? Mr. Farnsworth, George Farnsworth, made his fortune from lumber. He had 3 children, Edith, George Jr., and Richard. They were all raised in this house. And actually later, as adults, they moved in across the street. Many people in the neighborhood had kids who also built homes in this neighborhood. Note the date of the construction of this house. This is 1889. The Palmer Castle was done in 1885. And there were, very, very few other structures, right? So the time from the first mansion and then Potter Palmer, this was the 3rd house. There is a reason that this house was the 3rd house. And it's because this was a spec house. Spec meaning the house is built and completed without a buyer. So Potter Palmer not only had this vision, but he knew exactly how to do what he needed. So he built that magnificent castle to draw attention. And then he built several homes himself that he had designed and built out of his pocket so that he could encourage his friends and cohorts at work to think about coming to rent or buy the house. They're also interested, there were several, Potter Palmer built several spec houses in the Gold Coast. As a matter of fact, one of them was about 2 blocks south of this home. And it was actually the residence of Jamie Dimon and his family for several years of the chairman of and CEO of JP Morgan Chase. So the houses were handed down, but that's why he built these spec houses. Now we're going to look at the famous mid-century modern Farnsworth House that everyone is so familiar with. Okay, this is in Plano, Illinois. In 1945, Edith Farnsworth, and here she is with Mies, was at a dinner party. She was at a dinner party with Mies van der Rohe, and they began chatting, and they seemed to hit it off. There's speculation there was more than a friendship, but that has never been proven. And she hired him to build her a home in Plano, Illinois. Although much of our history tends to focus on the famous Mies van der Rohe, Edith deserves some real attention here. She was 6 foot tall. She was an accomplished violinist who studied in Italy. She switched careers to go to med school and was a kidney specialist and had her own private practice. And by the way, when she attended Northwestern Medical School, there was a limit to the number of women that they could have per class. So you could only have 4 women in each class in the med school, and she was one of them. So back to the talk of the house, okay? As can be expected for all construction projects, it doesn't matter if it's Mies van der Rohe or not, the work was seriously over budget, much delayed, and seemingly contrary to the original plans. Lawsuits popped up on both sides. Mies did end up victorious, although she was finally financially compensated. And there was a quick and final dissolution of that relationship, whatever it was. But the saddest part of the story is because of all of that, Edith was never really happy in this house, and she was never a big fan. Okay, so now this is pretty familiar for most of us. This is 1500 North Lakeshore Drive. I think we all recognize this beautiful white co-op building, 1500 North Lakeshore. The building was financed by William Wrigley in 1928, and it was designed by Rosario Candela, who is a very well-known New York architect who seldom worked in the city of Chicago. This co-op building is home to many residents of note, although it's not common knowledge who they are. But perhaps the most interesting and fun thing about this building is its roof. It's called the Woodruff Terrace, and its first owner from 1930 to 1940 was a prominent businessman. He was the owner of several banks in Chicago and one of the founders of the Chicago Opera Company. This terrace houses an 18-room residence that's wrapped around a full garden and a koi pond. As new residents, the Woodruffs, who were socially upscale, if you will, hosted a grand party to show off the pond. That was truly unique to have a pond on the roof, much less an entire apartment complex. But to their dismay, when the guests hurried back to check this out, surprise, there were no koi in the pond, as the seagulls from Lake Michigan had eaten them all. No one ever thought of that. So the next building we're talking about is the Playboy Mansion. Most people today, when you talk to them about the Playboy Mansion, they think of his mansion in Los Angeles. But us Chicago folks, we think about this Playboy Mansion. This house was built in 1899. It had 72 rooms. And this was originally the home of Dr. George Isham Snow, very prominent physician in Chicago. It became the Hefner House, of course, to all of us, and the original Playboy Club from 1959 to the early 70s. As time went on in the 70s and late 60s, there was a physical club somewhere else. But while it was here, I guess it was after the 70s, while it was here, the club was actually in the house, okay? Supposedly Hefner bought this house because he was able to put a pool in the basement, and it was one of the few he could do that with. The residence, of course, during the late 60s and 70s was known for Hefner's wild parties, in his big round bed where he conducted business in his pajamas. However, I was in the neighborhood in the early 70s, and almost no one from the neighborhood had been inside, to tell you the truth. It was movie stars mostly. But there were many parties in the neighborhood in high-rises overlooking the building, fundamentally male parties. It was a rule that the bunnies had to be tan during the summer, wearing their summer bunnies outfit. So they often sunbathed on the roof without bathing suits. So many parties around them. The other big neighborhood conversation place was the doorway to the Hefner house. Now, why would that be? The reason, it's a lovely entrance, but the reason that was so talked about was the sign that in Latin that read, "If you don't swing, don't ring." Nobody really got to see that very much because the gates were locked, but it did hang on the door on the right-hand side. That I did see. The next house is the house of John Welborn Root at 1308 North Astor, which is a little south of the homes we're talking about now. We simply couldn't have this story without him. He was an architect, John Welborn Root. He lived and died in this house at 1308 North Astor Street. On Sunday evening in January, he stood on this porch in his tuxedo and bid goodnight to the contingent from New York City, who he and Burnham were courting to get the bid for the World's Columbian Exposition. 2 days later, he died upstairs of pneumonia. He worked so closely with Burnham and was his right-hand man. And Burnham at that point was dismayed and angry and sad and just broken. His partner and best friend was gone. So he and several other Chicago architects designed Root's gravestone, a Gaelic cross, with a replica of which was what was Root's last architectural drawing. This is the Robert Todd Lincoln House, which many of us don't even know existed here. I certainly didn't. This house is located at the corner of Scott and Lakeshore Drive. Once again, it's now a high-rise. During the time that Lincoln lived here, he was a partner in a prestigious law firm and president of the Pullman Rail Company. He also served as ambassador to the UK, to England, and he was Secretary of War. His final resting place is in Arlington National Cemetery with his immediate family. He is the only member of Abraham Lincoln's close family not to be interred in Springfield. So he's at Arlington. So this part of the story is about Andrew Rabori. It's a name that probably many of us do not know, but he was truly a Gold Coast neighbor, not just because he lived here at 1325 North Astor, but his works are so very much a part of our neighborhood. He built many significant, unusual structures that we live among and pass by every day, as well as traditional buildings. These are two of the buildings that he built. They are the Frank Fisher Apartments and the Florsheim Mansion. Now, built in 1937 and 1938. Now, the one on the left, the white building, is something we talk about. We mention sometimes where we say, you know, that white building between the CVS and the high rise at the corner of State and Division with the glass blocks? We're talking about the Fisher Apartments because everyone notices it. Fisher was purchased these apartments, this whole complex, when he was an executive at Marshall Field at the time. And inside there are 12 duplexes, and they all have parking spaces that are accessible from the back alley. The structure was converted, they were not condos, they were apartments. They were converted to condos in 2000. So the next one is, we call it the Florsheim Mansion. And this is further north on State Street. and it's kind of the sister building to the Fisher Apartments. The reason we call it the Florsheim Mansion is because in 1946, Bertram Goldberg, who gave us Marina City, also lived in the Gold Coast, and he redesigned the structure for his mother-in-law, Lillian Florsheim, as in the Florsheim shoe family, and he added a studio in the rear for her sculpture work. She was famous for her sculpture work. So it's a different building. One is white, one is just the natural stone, but they certainly have a similar footprint. The next building that he was responsible for is our Racquet Club, which is on Dearborn, and that's familiar to all of us. This is a traditional structure, and look how incredibly different it is from the Florsheim Mansion and the Fisher Apartments. This was designed to reflect the Doge's Palace in Venice. He also was responsible for the high-rise apartments at 1325 Astor. He also lived in these apartments, making him again a member of the Gold Coast, making him a Gold Coast neighbor. He had also built high-rise apartments around the Racquet Club. Unfortunately, he died at 6 East Scott here in this building in 1996 and was buried at Graceland. A real neighborhood guy. So we're going to end our story today at the corner of Goethe and Dearborn. This is the home of what was the beautiful Three Arts Club. This was built by Holabart and Roche. Its purpose was to house single women who journeyed here to study the arts, because at that time it really wasn't acceptable for ladies of means to live alone. At some point, though, there was no more need for this type of facility, and unfortunately, it stood empty for years. Then several years ago, RH, Restoration Hardware, took over, thank goodness, and made a beautiful place to showcase their furniture, and developed a magnificent restaurant in the interior called the Three Arts Cafe that was in what was originally an open courtyard, and they closed the courtyard and established this restaurant. And it's just so nice to have sandwiches in there. It's a lovely place. However, the real story here on this corner is what came before. It was the home of Eli Bates, and he was a lumber baron. It's a name we all should know, but few of us do, and I certainly didn't before I started studying this. He was a character. He was totally self-made. He was a former lighthouse keeper in Milwaukee who had a cork leg. He had a great sense of humor, a love of gambling, and raucous behavior. Sounds like a real Chicago guy, doesn't it? But importantly, he had the greatest respect and admiration for Abraham Lincoln. He left in his will the equivalent of almost $400,000 in today's value for a statue to be erected in honor of his hero. Unfortunately, Eli died 2 years before the monument was erected in Lincoln Park. But in recognition of this generous donation, at the historic unveiling in the park, in front of 10,000 guests, Mr. Bates' attorney spoke on his behalf and spoke of his love and respect for Abraham Lincoln. He stood on the platform shoulder to shoulder with Robert Todd Lincoln and Lincoln's grandson, Jack. The statue was unveiled, accompanied by a cannon salute and singing. This monument is so beloved by us all. Thank you, Eli Bates. And that concludes the talk.
Okay, Scottie, if you could.
Yes. Oh, yeah. All right.
I just needed to unmute. I'm sorry. I apologize.
Okay. And Amy, if you want to turn your video on too, that'd be great.
Yeah, where's that at? Oh, there we go. I'm so sorry. I'm so bad with this. I don't need video. Well, I do have, there is one question, Scottie, or there's a couple questions actually. I can't seem to get my video on.
All right, I can hear you.
You had indicated that the Palmer Castle, what happened to that?
It was demolished in 1950.
Oh, I missed the date. I apologize.
No worries.
It seemed like I thought you had said a different date, and it didn't seem like it was there that long. And that was to build the high rise?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Then we have another question. Is there any significance to the governor's Pritzker's mansion on Astor Street?
You know, unfortunately, there's not. That house was at one point more significant, but it has been redone 3 times. It's been incredibly, I mean, it's normal for these places to be updated inside, but this has been, the outside has been redone several times. So it's really no longer significant.
And what happened to Lincoln's place on Scott and Lakeshore?
It's a high rise. Excuse me 1 minute. I'm getting a note saying that I'm not on video, and Ames, oh, there we go. It says I'm blocked. Okay.
You're set. Very good.
There we
Thank you.
Sorry.
Well,
Yeah,
there
it's
I
all
I
of
was
those,
blocked also.
those places that I mentioned, they're all now, you know, high rises.
And then I have another question. What did Lincoln have a grandson? And at the unveiling, you said Lincoln, where Root is buried.
No, where Lincoln, Lincoln's family is all buried in Springfield. Abraham Lincoln and his wife and his other children are all buried in Springfield, Illinois. So Robert Todd Lincoln is the only member of that immediate family that's not with Lincoln in Springfield. Okay, and he's in Arlington because he was Secretary of War for the U.S.
What is Scottie, what is the significance of the stone marker to the west of the Lincoln statue? It is on the land of the History Museum between North and Clark.
Is it the blob? No. There is a there is a blob of melted material that is west, but that isn't what you're talking about. So I'm not sure, Ames.
It says between North and Clark. So
I don't know.
maybe the questioner will add a
Give us
little
some
more
insight.
detail
Yeah.
to that. But what's the blob?
There was you know, museums save all kinds of things, and this is kind of fun. There was a hardware store in our neighborhood that burned in the Great Chicago Fire, and you know, it was so hot that the blob is the size of a desk, and it was all of the hardware and nails and all of that stuff that melted down into a huge blob. And they're going to really they're redoing Lincoln Park, you know, with the trail, and they're going to make that more visible than it is now, because it's just very interesting to think it could be that hot to have everything melt into just a pool.
Interesting. So back to the stone marker, it's surrounded by a black iron gate.
Is
Ringing any bells?
is that the couch tomb? Is that a building, a structure? Okay, there's an iron gate around the couch tomb, which is a tomb.
Yes, that's it.
And Ira Couch owned the Tremont Hotel, and he was a very, very wealthy Chicagoan. Tremont Hotel was one of the inn places to stay in downtown Chicago. It's like in the 1850s. And he died in the Caribbean and was moved up here and buried. And in about 1860, they started moving the Lincoln Park Cemetery. Same time they were moving the Catholic cemetery. And they were removing all the bodies, and that mausoleum did not get moved. And no one really knows why. Well, it weighed 11 tons. That might be a good reason. And they don't really know who's in there. We're not sure who all's in there besides Ira. But that's all that's left of the Lincoln Cemetery that we know, except, of course, all the bodies that never got moved.
Oh, that's interesting. What is the address of the Palmer Castle? What was the address? The actual
address. Now, Roger can tell us that because he lives in the building that's there. Roger, what's the address?
It's 1350 North Lakeshore. It might be 1350, 1360, but yeah, those two buildings.
Right. So there you have it. But they liked the 100, and so they were the Palmers.
Is there anything interesting you could share about Cedar Street?
I'm sure there is. I have been just kind of studying street by street, because when you're hearing this now, think of all the people that made substantial contributions to the city. You know, it's very interesting. I don't know specifically about Cedar. I know a couple things about Bellevue, and it's just going to have to be in the next study group, because you can bet your bottom dollar that a bunch of those row houses, those old beautiful row houses, they had prominent people living there. And it is the prominent people that we tend to have records of. It's not that they really did more, it's just there are written records on those families.
Did the Palmer mansion go through to Astor Street from Lakeshore Drive?
The grounds did. I'm trying to think. The grounds did, but they may have later been built on before the mansion came down, in 1950.
Another question. Can you talk about the house between Banks and Schiller with the beautiful courtyard?
Between Banks and Schiller on Astor.
I believe so.
The beautiful courtyard. Oh, are you talking about on the east side of the street? That would be the Goodman Mansion with the Court of the Golden Hand. Okay.
Tell us about it.
Okay, well, okay. It's a grand mansion. It's a Howard Van Doren Shaw mansion, and it really is beautiful. It's like a quarter of a block long, and it does have a back garden, and the only way you can see it is when you look through what was the carriageway. And the knockers on the door are hands, and they're gold colored. And so the house got to be known as the Gate of the Golden Hand. It's one of my favorite places because Goodman's son, and my son's an actor, as you know, Ames, was an actor. And he was very active in theater in Chicago, and he was also a writer. And he really, the son, who was like in his 30s, really believed that we should have, Goodman's son, that theater shouldn't just be for the rich. It shouldn't just be for people who go downtown and can spend a lot of money. The theater should be for the people. And so he championed neighborhood theaters. And we are really the only city in America that has neighborhood theaters that don't move from place to place. Tickets are $30. They're small and they're not wealthy, and you can see really good theater. Tragically, the son in 1819 and 20, in 1918 and 1920, we were having a pandemic, which we're familiar with, and he caught the virus. And so he was at Great Lakes Naval Station. They brought him home, and he died in that home on Astor Street. And there's a beautiful memorial in Graceland Cemetery for him right on the lake. So there's a great story behind that house. Good question.
So you said that was one of your favorite houses in the Gold Coast. Is there any other favorites that maybe you didn't include? Like, what would be your number one good story house that you didn't include in tonight's
That I
presentation?
didn't include. I think it would have been the Goodman Mansion, which we just talked about. Because other than that, I tried to do my favorites, you know, the Farnsworth. And of course, where I lived in 1444, that is such a beautiful house. And I have talked to the owner, and he let me come in and go through the house. And the family absolutely loves it. And they complete, of course, it was 10 apartments before. So it's been completely gutted and redone, and everything has gone back to the original. And it's really beautiful.
Anyone else have any questions? Well, thank you oh, wait, we've got one more.
The Charnley House?
Was Goodman Theater named after the son?
Yes. And it was primarily paid for by the parents, and the original Goodman Theater was at the Art Institute. It was not where it is now. And I think what just popped up on the screen, somebody said, what about the Charnley House?
Yes.
It's just you only had so much time to do so many houses. Everybody's probably overwhelmed anyway.
So yeah, there's a question of what about the Charnley House at Astor and Schiller?
Yeah, that's the one. That's a very significant house, but I just didn't have time for it.
Is there anything briefly you'd like to say about it?
It's a beautiful house, and Frank Lloyd Wright worked on it, and Sullivan was in charge of the work. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, for those of us who know a little bit about him, he claims to have had a huge influence. Others think that not so much. But it's a really interesting structure, and it, like 1444, it's different. You know, it is not the same as same feeling as the other houses on the street.
What about the Egyptian house on Delaware? I'm trying to picture that.
The Egyptian house on Delaware. I don't know.
Is there only one building on Lakeshore Drive that cannot be torn down?
I actually don't think there are any that can't be torn down. I haven't, well, yes. I mean, I think the Surgeons building is, if it's landmarked, it can't be torn down. And so I think that all of those, the Surgeons building and the museum, and the building where the Polish embassy is, I think all three of those are landmarked, which means they can't be torn down.
That's an interesting question about the medical museum, or with the medical museum being sold or for sale.
Actually, the medical museum was not sold. The house next to the medical museum was sold. And that was the house of the International House of Surgeons. And that was, you know, at a time, I mean, it was established, I don't know, like in the 40s. And my uncle, who was a surgeon, used to come and have meetings there all the time. He was the head of the Orthopedic Surgeon Association. So it was the home of a bunch of associations of surgeons. And it's incredible inside and beautiful. But they haven't been able to sell it because I think it can't be torn down. And so it was actually on the market. 2 buildings were on the market for $13 million, and they keep reducing the price. The way that those houses were saved in the first place is they were sold for the taxes. The taxes during the Depression became so grand that people couldn't pay the taxes. So they just sold them to people for nothing if they'd pay the taxes.
The Egyptian house is actually on Dearborn, not Delaware.
Dearborn.
That's starting to ring a bell.
The Egyptian house. Do you know that, Amy? I don't know.
I live on Deer, but it has Moorish windows, and I'm trying. Oh, the one right next door to me.
I don't think that's Egyptian. It's
I think that's the one.
the architect's name
Moorish
starts with an M.
windows.
I can't remember, but I don't think it's Egyptian. I think it is Moorish. And I don't know much about the history. It has 3 apartments in it. I know. That's all I know.
Do you know how the street Goethe got its name? German poet in Chicago.
Yeah. When I mentioned the reason that we were able to get the archdiocese, it was a growth of the German Catholics. I mean, the Old Town was just completely German almost. Now, what did she want to know specifically about that? The reason the street name is Schiller. Okay, so Schiller and Goethe, and there's another one, are all German philosophers or writers or educators. And so it's the influence of the German population that named all those streets after prominent German people. And at some point, I read that like Schiller was the best known German in Germany in like 1900. I mean, that's how popular those men were. And that's why the streets are named after Germans.
So we're getting to the end of our time.
Okay.
There is one.
I'll jump in with the question because I can't ask questions on the stream, but and we were talking about streets. So I want to bring this up. There's a wooden street behind, by the Cardinal Mansion.
Right.
What's the significance of that?
The significance of that is simply that it's one of only 2 that are left. When the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 happened, something like 80% of the city of Chicago had those wooden pavers. They're called Nickerson pavers. And there were square pieces of wood over a bed of tar with tar in between. So we were just a city, we had so much access to wood that when the fire started, our streets were wood with those pavers, the sidewalks were wood, most of the houses were wood, and that's what made it possible when the wind got so great for this fire to be so incredible and to travel so fast. So that was one of the only alleys, it was an alleyway, it is an alleyway, that exists that had the pavers in it. And so what they've done is actually 2 years ago, they took the original pavers were taken up and stored, and some new pavers were put down. But that's one of only 2 alleyways that were left in the city after the fire.
Is it true that Hemingway lived in the Gold Coast?
He lived on Dearborn, and he didn't live there very long. It's one of those where, he lived there a minute and a half, and they put a sign up on the building going, Hemingway lived here, okay? I think he was there for like 6 months. But, his family was in the suburbs. And he did live here for a short period of time, yeah.
What about the building that houses the Graham Foundation?
That I can't recall right now and who the owner and builder was, but it was significant, obviously. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. And it was later taken over by the Graham Foundation because, again, people couldn't pay the taxes, right? And I can't remember the name of the man who built it, but it really is beautiful. And it has a garden on the side.
Oh, one of our attendees were talking about the Moorish building on Dearborn.
Oh, good. What they said.
And they said that they believe the homeowner traded in the Middle East.
That makes
So that would
sense.
be that influence.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And then another attendee said Hemingway also lived on Division briefly. Did you know that?
I did not. I did not. They probably didn't put a sign up.
Is there anything else you'd love to tell us about our neighborhood that was not asked?
Oh, gosh.
Like something fun.
Well, Amy Lamar lives here. There goes the property rates. You know, I can't think of anything. That's probably a good question, but
Maybe like, you know, what's a like, is there any haunted houses with Halloween coming up? In
okay, all right.
Gold
Okay,
Coast?
so that reminds me of something that probably would be of interest for some people. So when you think about it, so it's 1865 and they are moving, and this land it is amazing we have high rises in the city of Chicago because we are built absolutely on a marsh. Okay, and it is incredibly wet. And like I said, it was difficult to build the mansion in the first place. And so when they decide, that's part of the reason they decided to move the cemetery is because bodies were popping up out of it between when they would flood. So it was just, you know, it was just a total mess. So the truth be known, there are bodies under, especially those 2 blocks of Astor Street down to Schiller. There are bodies under all of those houses, and they have found bones when they dug any of them. And actually, Mr. Coven Bowen, when her house was being built, she was sort of freaked out where they found all these bodies under the house, because you go in to move the bodies, the caskets have rotted, you know, and the bones are under there. And the other thing that happened is some of those people have been buried for 40 years. And so when you're told you got to go get your relatives and move them, if you don't have the money to do it, or you've moved away, you just don't do anything, and the bodies remain there. So there are bodies. When the Chicago History Museum built a parking lot across the street from the museum, they found 12 bodies. You know, there are bodies all over Lincoln Park, and there are bodies all over that part of Astor Street. So
Well,
happy Halloween to everybody, okay?
Do you know anything about 1520 North State across from the Wood Alley? It has a beautiful doorway.
Across from the alley on State Street.
Yes.
No, I don't know particularly what house it is. They're all pretty magnificent, if you want to know the truth. I mean, they're doorways and stuff, but I don't know what that one is. It's great. It's great
about the Halloween.
I know. It's great fun to uncover these stories. I have to share that with everyone. I mean, you look at these structures and you don't know hardly anything about it, and then all of a sudden you find out about, you know, who lived there and what they did, and things like, why on earth did Louise de Coven Bowen, why did she build her house sideways on the property? Every single other house on the street faces the front. You know, so they're just, the more you dig, the more it begs the next question. You know, there's always a next question to be answered. And how did that happen? And that's the really fun part of digging into history like this.
Do you have any information on the historic Viceroy?
No, I don't know what that is.
Oh, we have a nice little note. Interesting information to add for you. The Gold Coast Neighbors Association was instrumental in restoring the wood alleyway.
Oh, excellent. I did not know that. Well, good on you. That's great.
Yeah, that's a good one. The old Cedar Hotel, that's the Viceroy on State Street.
That's okay. All right. I don't know much about it. I'm glad they saved the facade, right? For the Cedar. I mean, but I don't know much about the Viceroy. That's interesting. Tell her I'll find out. That'll be my next project. We're doing a better and better job of at least keeping facades of some of these buildings. which is better than destroying the whole thing.
Well, that's like the movie theater when they built that
Yeah.
building at North and Clark. Is there any significance there that they saved the facade, or just the beauty of it?
It's just the beauty of it, but I'm sure there's stories about it, you know. It's next to what, the Germania Club?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
What you said earlier, just to confirm, 4 houses on Astor south of Banks were all developed by Palmer as spec houses?
I believe it's 4. That's as close. So I know it's the Farnsworth, and I know the house that Jamie Dimon lived in were spec houses. But I was completely surprised by that, you know, that at that point in time, you know, in 1884, Palmer was building spec houses. And I know, I've heard there were 4. I know there were 3. That's all I know.
Is there anything you could tell me about the building, condos or apartments on Schiller across from the Racket Club, northwest corner?
Across from the Racket Club, yes, they were also designed by Rabori. And the interesting thing about those apartments, I mean, he was amazing in his scope of, you know, doing this modern stuff. And then the Racket Club after, you know, the Doge's Palace in Venice. That apartment complex has a beautiful garden inside, and every unit is different. Rabori designed every unit different. You know, usually they're just the same footprint. They're all different. And I haven't been in any of them, but I've seen the garden.
How many buildings did he build in the Gold Coast?
You know,
a lot.
Those that I mentioned that I know of, and I don't know whether there are any more either.
We have a comment regarding the Cedar Hotel.
Okay.
Hang out with the Gold Coast Rollerblading Club was the old Cedar Hotel, now Viceroy. They kept the facade, but built the fancy glass hotel behind. Okay. So just kind of giving us a little update. The Viceroy opened outdoor dining 2 weeks ago. They built a fancy hotel behind the glass, behind the facade. I thought there was some new information there.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think we might be done.
All right.
So this concludes our Q&A session. Thank you so much for Scottie. Some of the comments were actually about you, the questions. They were more like comments. We had a couple amazings. Someone actually asked about, are there tours in the Gold Coast? And Scottie actually does do tours in the Gold Coast and Graceland and Rosehill Cemetery. We'd be happy to provide her information to you. I think the season might be getting a little close to ending with the winter, but come spring and summer, it's time to start walking around again. If anyone would like more information about the Gold Coast Neighbors Association or would like to become a member, please visit our website at goldcoastneighbors.org. We hope to be bringing more presentations like this to you in the future in an online format, and really enjoy the history of our neighborhood. So thank you again, Scottie. You are amazing.
It's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thanks, guys.